Well, hello, everybody, and happy Pride Month. My name is George Smitherman. My pronouns are he and him. I have the great honor and distinction of being Ontario's first openly gay MPP, and only at that point the 200th in history, the little joke that I like to make. Now, amongst the people that I like to credit for the success that I enjoyed in politics, at least in terms of getting elected, is none other than Tom Allison. When people ask me, what's the best piece of advice that you could give me as a person interested in getting involved in politics? I said, try to get Tom Allison to help you out. So I'm really, really privileged, even though he lives just around the corner and I haven't had a chance to hug him in a bit, to be able to introduce my great friend, Tom Allison.
Thank you, George, for those very kind words. You're a dear friend. My pronouns are he and him. I have worked in politics since I left university. Started with the Peterson government, worked for every Liberal government at Queen's Park, worked federally, and I have run quite a few campaigns. The two that I am most proud of, I think, are electing George Smitherman to the legislature because he became the first openly gay or lesbian or transgendered or bisexual person in the Ontario legislature, and running Kathleen Wynne's leadership campaign because she became our community's first premier. So I'm really proud of those two campaigns that I was able to do something for us. And now I'm going to turn things over to my dear friend Emma.
Thanks, Tom. My name is Emma Wakelin. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm very proud to be part of this panel. And I look at the three men that are in this panel with me, and I started my political career back in 1996, just as I was finishing up university. And the very first organizer I met was Tom Allison, and he has served as a mentor and a friend to me since the 90s. And his friendship and George's friendship and Todd's friendship and inspiration has really helped me as I came out of the closet recently over the last few years. And these three individuals have done a lot to foster an environment where I felt safe in coming out and being who I am in politics. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Todd Ross.
So I'm Todd Ross. So thank you all for the introduction. Thanks, Emma. So my pronouns are he and him. I've been involved in politics for over 35 years as a volunteer, as an organizer, as staff, specifically to George Smitherman, and as a candidate for nomination. I'm Métis. I also identify as Two-Spirit. And both of those identities are underrepresented in politics. In 1990, I was fired from the Canadian Navy for being gay, in which in 2016, I sued the federal government and won in a class action for all former 2S LGBTQ2+ civil servants who face discrimination known as the LGBT purge. And won the largest LGBT+ settlement in history, and also received an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. So back to you, George.
You made us all proud, Todd, really. It was such a great moment. And, you know, what I was thinking was that today in the United States was a momentous day because the Supreme Court there has established, backed up many more rights for LGBTQ populations. And I was thinking that in 1986, one of the most monumental things for our community and for me in particular, me as an individual in the community, was when the David Peterson government embraced the opportunity, working with the NDP, to amend the Ontario Human Rights Code. Of course, it's been amended subsequently to enhance the protections, but that was a monumental moment, and I was in the gallery, and David Peterson spoke in a way that was really moving, even as I think about it now. And it's just so great to be a Canadian, really, and to have enjoyed the role of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms also in, advancing our equality and our protections. Todd, I liked going to all those when around 2000, just after I was elected, there was coming to life all those kind of smaller localized gay prides, and we traveled to all kinds of them in Ontario that one summer. It was great fun.
That's right, yeah. And you really saw the community coming alive, and there were still challenges that it wasn't long since there was attacks in the nightclub in London that we ended up being at London Pride and seeing the community coming together and just sort of those I wouldn't say early days, because there have been generations of people who have been fighting for our rights. But certainly you saw the communities and smaller communities around Ontario coming alive and people being more comfortable and being supported.
One of the best prides that I've been to, because of my friendship with Doug Elliott, was Pride in Elliott Lake. You had to have seen it to appreciate it.
I've been there.
Well, I had my own kind of pride in Elliott Lake with my two-spirited wedding. And one time I was trying to come to the Elliott Lake Pride, and we were flying around in an airplane but couldn't land there, which is my experience with trying to fly into Elliott Lake. It's a challenging airport, but that's such a remarkable, what Douglas did there in Elliott Lake is remarkable. He catalyzed an event, but there was so much community there that wanted to embrace it. Emma, we use this word community a lot, but you've been identifying more with the community you mentioned in your opening as kind of a bit more recently, where the others of us on here are kind of old hands at it. How is that for you?
Well, I've been involved in the party for 25 years, and I mean, obviously I was trans for almost 40. So I would love to say that it's easier today for a trans person to come out and live their life, but as we've seen in the last couple of weeks on the attacks on the trans community across the world, and several prominent celebrity voices attacking trans rights, it's a tough go. And you mentioned today, or the three of you mentioned your favorite prides, and I think today, without sounding too emotional, today is actually my favorite pride. A friend of mine, she's undergoing gender confirmation surgery as we speak right now. She's on the operating table, and she's able to get that because liberal governments, and George, you were part of that, who stood up and said in Ontario, it is a right to get gender confirmation surgeries in this province, and it reduces the suicide rate from sometimes up to 50% of trans people to less than 10. So today's my favorite day, not only because of the Supreme Court ruling, but because a friend of mine has a greater chance of surviving because of what we were able to accomplish in the last 20 years.
Well, that's really heartwarming. I mean, Mike Harris, for the time that he was in office, took away, eliminated, cut so many things, and many of the cuts and changes that they made were just mean-spirited. And the politics of the moment were a little bit challenging, but I just credit Dalton McGuinty when people talk about the opportunities that we had in our government to advance an agenda for LGBTQ people. Dalton was really important part of creating the conditions that allowed that. Rainbow Health Ontario was something else that we invested quite a lot of energy on, the idea that no matter where you were in Ontario, services should be operating in a way that are sensitive to individual community needs and stuff. So those were, it was my privilege to be able to actually bring to the cabinet table the reinstatement of sex reassignment surgery. I can't remember if I told this story. Well, I think I wrote about it in my book, which was that when I took it to cabinet, I told everybody that Alberta had SRS. So if Alberta had sex reassignment surgery, then why would it, that would be a natural, why not in Ontario? and we reinstated, and then like within just a few weeks, Alberta actually sadly took it away, and I'm not sure that's been improved or corrected in Alberta, but hopefully. But those were those were interesting issues for sure. And I think just our party and its openness to gay people created a lot of openness for people in the Ontario Public Service also. That OPS Pride organization, which I think is quite dynamic, if I'm right, it found its openness in the approach that Dalton brought to governing. And then Todd, maybe you should remind people about the Mark Hall prom case, because that was really fun. And what we got ourselves involved in the midst of there was the kind of things that you just have, we just had the good fortune to be able to play a role in all of that. And I remember when you brought me that issue and said, "Did you see about this?" And we sprung into action and did really kind of cool and important things.
Yeah, and that was Mark Hall, who at the time was in high school, was getting ready to go to his prom. He was at the Durham Catholic Board and wanted to bring his boyfriend to the prom. And the board said that he wasn't allowed to bring his boyfriend, and we really put together a coalition of people who supported Mark. And I remember going out to the board meeting. And the number of people who had showed up to support Mark, and of course we had brought in, you mentioned Douglas Elliott before, we had brought in Douglas Elliott to help us, and the coalition that formed around
Justice David Corbett. That's
right. Yeah, it represented Mark, and the school board would not back down on that. To the point where they were canceling the prom. So we held a prom for Mark at church in Wellesley. Yeah, that was one of the early movements when we were still in opposition working together, that we were able to provide a bit of energy to.
That was great fun.
What's interesting to me is that each of you have achieved a lot of success in your careers, and whether you've known it or not, you've served as inspiration and mentors to a lot of us. Is that something that you keep in the back of your mind as an organizer? Like Tom, you've run 1 million campaigns, and you're known as being one of the best campaign managers in the country. But do you also recognize that you're a bit of a mentor and inspiration to people who in the queer community?
Yeah, I can remember, for example, when Dan Moulton told me that he was going to be our candidate in Oxford. And I don't know, I just felt, I mean, I knew that his likelihood of winning wasn't very great, but I so admired that here's this very smart, young, gay liberal living a very out life, who went home to what's the name of the community in Oxford? The biggest city, Woodstock. Went home to Woodstock to be our Liberal candidate, and I loved the milestone that represented, because I can tell you that when I was young and very interested in politics, it never occurred to me that I could run for public office. I assumed that as a gay man, I could not achieve that, and I never thought about it. I ruled it out. That was never something I was going to be able to do. And then I met George. And I don't know if George remembers, but I called George. He didn't ask me to be his campaign manager. I called George because he and I weren't very good friends. We just sort of knew each other. And I thought, this is not right. He and I should be friends. We have so much in common. And I phoned George and said, I want to run your campaign. And I did. And he succeeded. And that was a milestone. And so, one last thing, I remember the first 2 politicians that I worked for as a staff person, I never told either one of them that I was gay, because I honestly believed that there was a good chance I'd be fired. And I remember working for Alan Rock. I spent 7 years working for Alan, and I remember going to his swearing in Ottawa when he was sworn in as Justice Minister. and his wife, Debbie, put her arm around me, gave me a hug. And I don't remember now what the words were, but what she communicated to me in that hug and the few words was, we know who you are and we love you. And it, for me, that was a big watershed, because after that, I didn't conceal my who I was from anybody that I worked with, worked for in politics. So I think in my lifetime we've seen tremendous strides, and they're not over, but we're lucky that we've had the successes that we've had.
Well, you said the word love. That's always what I tell people. I had a gentleman, I haven't even met him yet. In my new business life in the cannabis sector, I met a guy on from an allied trade that supports the cannabis sector, and then I was on a call with him last week, and at the end of it, he said, "Now I just need your advice on something, because my 9-year-old son just told me that he's identifying that he likes boys more than girls, and I'm concerned I said the wrong thing, or can you help?" I said, "Did you use the word love?" He said, "Yeah, of course, me and my wife." I said, "Then I think you're off to a really good start," because for me, when I was, confronted with my sexual orientation by my mother, because she found a stash of, what, not cannabis. And, she and my stepdad, really made the point to me that they loved me, and they just only had concern for my health and my well-being. It was harder for me to come out to my father. And actually, until I bought my store at Church and Wellesley, and he met Marcus, I think, it was kind of like instead of telling him, I just invited him down to the new business environment stuff. But, the saddest bit about my dad passing early was that we were just coming to terms with it, and our relationship was just strengthening. And I know that so many people have suffered just from a bad start where parents weren't able, capable, educated, what have you, to just love your kid, just no matter what, to express that as a starting point.
My first job, which was the Canadian Navy, where I was still deeply closeted, and knew that if I did come out, I would lose my job, and that's eventually what happened. And then after that, sort of recognizing that I did not want to work in an environment where I could not be open. I sought out places where I could be openly gay and not have to worry about it. So, I was thrilled when I had the opportunity to go work for George. And that was certainly an office where you didn't have to worry about who you were, that there was that love and welcoming to be there. And that's kind of how, because of that early experience, that I have just refused to work in any environment where I couldn't be who I am.
I had a question for you, actually, Emma, because Tom and Todd and George here, we have by now had a chance to establish ourselves and to enjoy many of the benefits from equality and such. But your journey is both more recent, more visible, more, to me, like fundamentally so much more courageous than anything that I ever had. Like, I sometimes feel that I have to apologize because I don't really have a lot of bad stories about coming out. I was embraced by my family. I worked in the Peterson government in days that gave me an opportunity to actually come out quietly and one by one, but nevertheless. So, I just want to make sure in the time that we have here that we are all just also instilled in an understanding of what that looks like today for you, and also whatever encouragement you might offer us, because I think that there's more that we could be doing to lend support to the trans community, as an example. And maybe, Emma, you could give us some insights into what we could be, what you think politics today should be doing, political organizing today should be doing to actually be more trans welcoming.
Well, thank you, Todd. And yeah, it's true that just for virtue of being gender nonconforming, obviously, that puts in a very marginalized community that's still unfortunately very marginalized. But I also recognize I still, as a white person, still privileged in that the average lifespan for a trans Black woman is 35 years old, which is medieval, to be honest. But the reality in politics is that, and I don't want to be flippant here, but I think that trans rights are about at least 2 decades behind. I don't know if mainstream is the right word to use, but the broader LGBTQ community. The reality in North America, I mean, there's probably about 90 legislatures that sit in subnational governments, and there's only 4 sitting transgendered legislators. One in Danica Rome was the first in Virginia in 2017, which is only 3 years ago. And there's 3 more trans people got elected in 2018, 2 in New Hampshire and 1 in Colorado. And one person in Canada came out as trans in Alberta. They were an MLA in Alberta, and they came out as trans during a transgender debate. So we are decades behind. I think the mainstream parties, and in my experience, and I don't know the exact number, but I know that I'm only one of 2 campaign managers that I know of in a major political party in this country. There may be more, but it's certainly less than 10, and I don't think it's more than 5. So I think political parties in this country, certainly the Liberal Party, has to be more cognizant of in the candidate nomination process and making sure that trans candidates get a fair shot at nominations and in ridings that are quote unquote winnable, not just put up as tokens in communities where they have no chance. And we have to recognize too that the employment rate of the trans community is around 16%, not the unemployment rate, but the employment rate. So already in terms of just being visibly marginalized, we're economically marginalized. So we don't necessarily have the resources to win a nomination or to put up a well-financed campaign. So the parties need to be able to build that infrastructure or help trans candidates navigate that infrastructure. And we have to do a better job of getting organizers in the party as well. I just can't believe that I'm only one of 2 that I know of in the Liberal Party, at least nationally. And I had the privilege of being passing as a white male for most of my career, and that's when I got the majority of the campaigns that I ran. So I know the Ontario Liberal Party is walking the walk, but we have to do better, and we have to acknowledge those realities and try to make a difference.
And some advice that I would offer to Liberals who are watching this session that we're having is make friends with somebody who's trans. I consider myself really very, very lucky to be a friend of Emma's, because I feel like I've learned a lot. I think that's just the natural consequence of having a good friend come out. Now, that's true whether they come out as gay or whether they come out as bisexual or as lesbian. But in Emma's case, she came out as a trans person, and my education began. And the thing that I concentrated most on was just trying to be a good friend, because I was pretty confident that if I got that right, if I was just a good friend to Emma, that I would along the way learn a lot, and she would gently educate me if I got something wrong. I was never in fear that she'd jump down my throat and be critical if I used the wrong pronoun, or if I made the wrong assumption, or if I brought some of my biases to the table. She's been a great friend, and I'm grateful that I've learned as much as I have.
You're going to make me cry.
Well, Emma, maybe there aren't that many campaign managers, trans-identifying campaign managers, but in the same way that others of us have had a chance to encourage other people to participate, to take up politics, I'm sure you're going to do that for us for many also. So I'm going to think about today as my favorite pride because of the story that you were able to bring to the table. Most of the rest of us are just reminiscing, but you're bringing us the real live lived goods of people, like I said earlier, that I think are just so courageous. And I for one am ready to be encouraged to do more, Emma. So if you're starting up some campaign or what have you, you make sure to give me a call. But my first advice is call Tom first.
Well, you're both on a list of people for me to call, that's for sure, and I will take you up on that.
And Emma, I'm really happy that you've got the role you have with the Ontario Liberal Party, doing mentoring and education, because I think it puts you right in the eye of the hurricane in terms of teaching people to be better in politics and to have success in politics. I think the party is very lucky to have you in that role.
Well, thank you, Tom, and I'm very excited about it, and I view it as an opportunity to not just help build the education of our party on campaign readiness, but also on in broader social issues. And to say that I was a little frightened of taking the role, because, you know, what does that mean driving at night to some isolated communities who might not be exactly, it's always a fear in the back of my mind, but it's something that you just you can't make the world a better place unless you set an example. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, if you need anyone to share the driving, I like logging kilometers, and it'll remind me of my time as an OLP field organizer in 1986. So
as long as you like bad music, I'm up for a drive anytime, George.
George,
I always find race that.
You can sit in the back, Emma, and then it'll remind George of the reverse of when he was a minister.
Oh yeah, yeah, great. Well, I think that Todd, maybe you should wrap things up for us with some reminiscence or some ideas about where you think we need to put our energy going forward.
I think thanks, George. I think really it's just being supportive. You know, we just talked about how, you know, we want to be supportive of Emma and supportive of each other. And I think just having that recognition of being able to both ask people, but also to approach people, sometimes without being asked, and just go up and support each other as best we can, so that we can always do better. And if we keep that in our mind, and if we keep that in our heart, that we will be here talking in another 20 years about how wonderful everything is.
I look forward to that.
Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride, everybody. Thanks for watching.
And I love you all.
Love you all too.